Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 18th episode of the Women Startup Leader Series. In this series, key female ecosystem players from Bangladesh and beyond will discuss facets of angel investing and all things startup. In this episode, we have Vera Elizabeth Baker as speaker and Ariana Khan, analyst at Bangladesh Angels, as moderator.
So Vera Elizabeth Baker is a Paris-based venture partner at Jua Fund. Jua Fund is an early-stage Pan-African fund that invests capital and community into exceptional ventures. She invests in European startups as an angel investor for Atomico in the areas of sustainable solutions, future of food, and broadening access to care. She has also built a global community of women of color and allies that for Colored Girls Who Tech, a curated weekly newsletter highlighting entrepreneurship and venture capital in the tech ecosystem. We will hear from Vera about the Jua Fund, her experience as an angel investor with the Atomico Angel Programme, diversity in the European tech ecosystem and lessons for emerging markets such as Bangladesh, barriers that underrepresented founders face in attracting investments, and why it's important to invest in and support more such ventures. So thank you so much, Vera, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It sounds like a lot to talk about in an hour, but we'll see how far we get.
We like to start these sessions with, getting to know our speaker a bit more. So where did you grow up and what did you aspire to be when you were younger?
So again, Ariana, thank you so much for having me here. And I think it's so important to figure out how do we create communities and also how do we create these global communities and figure out what are the best practices and how we can work together and learn from each other. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and about what our best practices and the lens we use in which to invest. So I am an American based in Paris. I've been here now for about 10 years, but I grew up in San Francisco, California. So the home of tech. This is at a time when tech wasn't the big thing in San Francisco yet. And so this is when before all of the, as we say, the bohemian bubbles came in and invaded tech, San Francisco, and drew up the prices and essentially put other people out, and I would say poor people in San Francisco that essentially had to flee the city because they couldn't afford it anymore because of the tech people. So I think there's always good in some ways and with the bad. When I wanted to grow up, I wanted to be, I think, a writer. That was one of the first things that I really loved, was writing. And so I kind of stumbled into tech when I moved to Europe about 10 years ago. But before that, I had a very full career in politics in the United States Congress. And then when I moved to Europe, I wanted to figure out how do I essentially use my skill set that I had learned over the years to do something and to be helpful to founders that were looking essentially out west to expand their businesses. And so that's how I got my start into tech back in 2016.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. I think I can also relate to that. Growing up, I also had this aspiration to be a writer and still do. So moving on, like how did you, just diving deeper, how did you get into the VC industry?
So I started, as I mentioned before, I started off working when I moved to Europe. I wanted to figure out at that time I didn't speak French, I do now. And I wanted to figure out how I could be helpful to startups that were looking essentially out west to go and expand their businesses. And so I started off first as an operator. I started working for a company that had just completed Y Combinator in 2016. They had just graduated from the batch. And I joined the team as the only non-engineer on the team. And so I worked directly with the CEO. We were a small team of 5 and did everything from business development to working on their decks to working on investor relations, everything and anything that involved the startup I did. And one of the first things you do, as you may know, when you come out of these accelerators is you raise money. And so we raised about $3.5 million, largely from, even though we were a French-based company, we were raising from US and US investors. And so just the whole putting down the presentation, learning how to pitch, looking at the numbers and doing the analysis, this was all things I did. And so then I started to work directly hand in hand with the investors and thought, I actually kind of like their job. I wouldn't mind sitting on the other side of that table. So that's how I got my start. So from there, I worked in various capacities in tech and tech related fields. And it was maybe about a year and a half ago that I finally kind of took the plunge, first as an angel for Atomico, and actually, let's say even before that, I started investing on my own as an angel. And then I became one of Atomico's angels. And then after that, I took the role as a venture partner for the Jua Fund.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, though, the VC industry is so exciting, and me, as a novice in the industry as well, I think it's just packed with so much potential and so much to learn. So totally relate there. And so yeah, just diving deeper into, we previously talked about your weekly newsletter for colored girls who tech. Would love to learn more about what sort of prompted you to start it. Yeah, if you could just give us a brief overview about the newsletter. And yeah.
So one of the things I think that we find, I guess it depends on the environment where you're in, but when you are in European tech, a lot of times it is very similar, right? We've seen the stats. Atomico does a really good report every year looking at the stats of diversity in Europe, and it's really abysmal, right? Of the survey they've done, I think 80+% identify as Caucasian, and less than 0.2% actually identify as people or as Blacks that are in the tech field. And so what I had seen on my own was that there was a lack of diversity when it came to either the big tech events, from the Web Summits to the Slush to the Viva Techs, to contests and challenges that were happening where people of color, women, and people of color were essentially absent. And when I say diverse founders, I like to say that it's not just about, right, there's some obvious things that have to do with race and gender, but there are also some non-obvious things that have to do with religion, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, even just geographical diversity. And so when looking at European tech, one of the things that we find is that European tech is always about what's happening in the United Kingdom, and less so about what's happening in smaller countries and smaller regions. And so I essentially wanted to create a space for women of color to come to get the exact same information as everyone else, and so that they were essentially present in the room. And so my subscribers, although the name of it is for Colored Girls Who Tech, it is essentially for anyone and everyone in the tech industry. And in fact, I would say that I'd have about a third of my newsletter subscribers are actually men, and they come to this for the exact same information. So again, it was the idea of how do I create a space so that I'm hand delivering on a weekly basis the best events, the best competitions, be it in climate tech or anything across the board. How do I make this information available for other people? And so that's how I created the newsletter for the past 2 years. And that is essentially how I've started to create a name for myself, I think, in the European tech ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is very much needed, right? And in an era where there's just so much information and it's all over the place, having this curated in one place, I think I'm really grateful to you for, taking this initiative and, sending out these weekly free newsletters to the community. So yeah, I think my next question would be, what are your future plans with the newsletter? Like right now, I know it's more focused around opportunities in North America as well as the European tech ecosystem, but do you have any plans to sort of expand it into, say, South Asia, more specific, or broadly just Asia?
So no, I don't have those plans. What the newsletter essentially focuses on is opportunities, and actually that's not true. So what it now focuses on opportunities in, say, Europe, the USA, and Africa. So I try to combine those three spaces there. But I think in this upcoming newsletter, there's an event that's focused on a Chinese accelerator. I can't remember the name offhand, but someone had sent that information to me, and they were also focused on what was happening in food tech industry as well as in Africa. So if there are things that I find that are interesting that my community would want, the more people send me information, the more I'm likely to put it in there and to put out that call. But no plans essentially now to expand to do any other areas. And again, the idea is that it's a quick 5-minute read. We all get so many newsletters on a daily, if not weekly basis. The really idea is to how do I condense this information to essentially put out those, must apply events that people should have access to.
So yeah, moving on, you've also, mentored founders. That's something that you very actively do besides, even investing. Mentorship is an active role that you play in the European tech ecosystem. So yeah, would love to learn about, your experience with mentoring founders in the unconventional venture accelerators, which is, where just to give you a perspective, those in the audience, underrepresented founders present one of the biggest market opportunities today. But in the Nordics, only receive 1% of the capital. So Vera, if you could just walk us through,
Sure.
what the unconventional ventures accelerator is, what has been your, sort of role in mentoring founders through the accelerator.
Perfect. So I would say that if you don't know unconventional ventures, you should definitely put them on your radar. And also I would say to invite the GPs of that fund to this program. And I think they really just have a lot to offer. Thea Michelle and Nora Bave are the two members of the Unconventional Ventures team. Arlen Hamilton, who you may know, who's kind of a big persona in the kind of overall tech space, is also one of their venture partners and helps them with their deals and deal flows. And so this team started a few years back to essentially talk about those diverse founders that were missing from the Nordic ecosystem. And so every year they do an annual report, which they just released, I think last week. Two, they have a fund where they're constantly funding the unconventional, right? The founders that we don't necessarily see on a daily basis. So they're funding them through their venture capital fund. And then thirdly, last year, they created the first ever online accelerator for diverse founders. And so there was a lot of news and a lot of buzz, I think back in May, when SoftBank came to Europe and they decided to start an online accelerator, the Emerge program. You may have seen that. And they also committed capital behind that. So not just accelerating founders, but actually putting money behind them. But these guys were essentially the first ones. And you can look here, you're putting this on the screen here. This is a diverse group of people that are in the Nordics regions that people don't necessarily talk about, right? We have women, we have people that are wearing veils, we have all kind of immigrants from all over Europe that are represented in this bunch of what we call diverse founders. And so much of what we think of the Nordics looks like a typical Nordic blonde hair, kind of blue-eyed person. And the reality is that the Nordics is so much richer than that. And so they started and created this program and had a call out for investors all over, essentially, I would say the world. You see Arlen Hamilton's face is kind of prime front and center here from Backstage Capital, but essentially putting capital and resources to essentially help to accelerate the growth of these founders. So that is one of the programs I participate in. I'm also one of the mentors for another accelerator here based in Paris. It's called The Colors. So it's thecolor.rs. And they have an accelerator focused on founders of color in the beauty industry here in France. And so, the third one that I worked with as well this past year was also the Founders Institute. And I think there was someone, I think on your team also that's connected to the Founders Institute. And so the Founders Institute, as you may know, again, is one of these kind of large scale Silicon Valley based accelerators that's now essentially all over the world. And so we really come in at the early stages to help founders at the very ideation stage, right? So from the very beginning, this is my idea, this is what I want to do, to essentially how do I end the program by being incorporated and being ready to actually have a company ready to go and ready to essentially start raising money. And so those are the three programs that I was involved with really on a full-time basis last year, and then continue to mentor those founders. And then the last thing I'll say is that we recently attended Web Summit, which, as you know, happens every year in Lisbon. And so I was there just 2 weeks ago. And so with the GPs of Unconventional Ventures, Thea, Michelle, Nora Bave, with a couple of other angels in the ecosystem, we put together the first ever diversity event for diverse founders at a European Tech Summit. And so we put out the call, let's say a week before. We had over 200 RSVPs and over 150 people actually showed up and attended this event. And again, diversity in all of its beauty, what that means, we had founders from all over the board. And we also had investors from Balderton and L'Oreal and just the entire HD Capital Plan A, all these guys showed up because they wanted to be in that space. And all these guys are essentially looking for deal flow, right? If everyone is only looking at the same type of people, you're not going to make anything on those deals, right? And so we have to figure out how are we a little more agile and flexible, and how are we looking at people that normally we aren't talking to, but essentially are bringing the same ideas to the table.
Yeah, thank you for that. And drawing on from the part you mentioned, from your experience, what are some common areas that founders in the accelerator have needed guidance with from your observation?
Well, I think as a founder, I think all founders essentially have the same issues, right? When you're starting off, it's the basic things. I have an idea. How do I even move forward from ideation stage to getting together an MVP, to figuring out what are those options to actually get financing? And so from across the board, depending on what type of accelerators or what other type of groups you work with, you have founders with a range of questions, right? Is venture capital right for me? What does it mean to actually look at angels? How do I look at angels? Do I look at angels in my home country, or are any angels essentially up for grabs? And as you all know here, right, it is less interesting for you. I mean, it could be, but I think it tends to be less interesting for you to look outside of your region or your state or your country, wherever it is, because there's so many amazing founders already in your home territory, right? So if someone's going to pitch me from China, although they may have a great idea, it's more likely I'm going to look at the founders in my own backyard. And so the founders that are based here in France, or I would say based in Paris, or even based here kind of larger in France, I'm much more likely to look at those guys because they're in my backyard than I am to look at a founder that's based in Estonia, right? And so the idea is, how do we broaden our network to have more angels from all over that are having these kind of active chapters and are able to share that deal flow? And so I'm always, again, if I see founders in the food tech space in Argentina, and I know that it's an interesting space, but that's just not my area of comfort, I'm going to send it to some of the investors and the angels I know that are based in Latin America that would have a better sense of those deals and how things work in those marketplaces.
Absolutely. So just diving in deeper into the European tech ecosystem, what is the diversity in the European tech ecosystem like? And could you talk about, what sort of strategies are there in place to improve it in terms of, catering to underrepresented groups such as women?
So yeah, I would say, again, I think that a good baseline really is looking at the report that Atomico does every year on the state of diversity in tech. If you guys haven't checked it out, check it out. I think their launch date for the new report is I think it's December 7th or December 8th, which they'll do online. Traditionally, Atomico has done this every year at the Slush conference. And because of COVID, again, this year, they're going to essentially do it online. And so the state of European tech in general, I think, of diversity in European tech is abysmal, right? We don't have the numbers. And one of the first things we really have to do is focus on how do we get that data, right? Because without measurable data, you can't even talk about where there are holes and gaps in the space. And so the first part is that we as a whole need to figure out how do we measure this diversity data. And we saw this with Crunchbase. I think last year, there was a big push for them to create what they call the diversity spotlight. And so the diversity spotlight acts as such so that founders can self-identify as women or as people of color. And then you can then essentially go into there and track and look at these. And so when we talk about diversity data, and we can track and actually say, in the last 10 years, I think the number is 34 was the number. In the last 10 years, only 34 Black women have ever received funding in the entire United Kingdom in 10 years, right? Those are the horrible numbers we're talking about. The numbers are even bleaker in the EU, but the problem is we lack the data, right? We just don't have that data. So Atomico, I think back in 2018 was the first time they began actually tracking actual diversity statistics. And so we have some of those numbers, but part of this is just low and slow in coming in. And so we need to do a better job at essentially counting and being able to say, these are the neurodiverse founders. These are the people that are Muslim founders that aren't getting the funding. These are women founders. And so the first part, I think, is essentially tracking that data. And then two is, how do we make it so that on all sides of the table, not just in terms of the founders, but even as investors, and as angel investors, that there are more diverse people at the table, right, that can spot these opportunities. And so it's not just all the guys that grew up at, Paris and the big schools here, but actually new people and new ideas and new voices that they're bringing to the table to evaluate those potential, what are the potentials? What does the market look like based on my experience with these populations? I think this is an actual winner. And so how do we, again, just create diversity on both sides of the table so that there is it? And so even, again, I would say even in terms of women as investors in France, there was recently, I think it's Rivia, it's a firm that just rebranded. It was Gaia Capital before, and they just have a new name. They raised $250 million for their VC firm, announced last month. And so before that, women had never, right, in the entire EU, no VC firm headed by women had ever raised this amount of money before. And so I think just having that diversity at the table is super important on both sides, for the founder side and as well as on the investor side.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, we shouldn't be promoting diversity and inclusion just because, we see it as a social cause, but really because there is a business case to, having more diversity and inclusion within a startup ecosystem. So now I'd like to, learn more about your operational role with the Jua Fund. So just shifting gears a bit here. So as mentioned before, the Jua Fund is an early stage Pan-African fund that invests capital and community into exceptional founders. So Vera, if you could talk about, what the structure of the fund is like is it like a single LP fund, or if you could just walk us through that.
Sure. So I started working about a year now for Jua Fund, again, which, as you said, is an early stage Pan-African fund. We have a single LP, basically a single LP structure. And it was started because I worked for a gentleman by the name of Adam Mulai, who essentially wanted to empower African entrepreneurs with capital, right? Capital and, as we say, community. So we have a very extensive advisory network of other people that are actually able to help and be helpful to our various founders. And so we started off just under a year. We've already essentially written checks of about over $1 million. And so we have around three companies within our portfolio now. And so obviously these are kind of larger size checks to get to that over $1 million piece. And so the idea was, again, how do we empower African entrepreneurs with capital? And so many times I think we have these accelerators, we have mentoring programs, but at the end of the day, what's going to really help founders is actually giving them a chance to start and to actually work on their ideas with actual capital. And so that's how the Jua Fund came about. We are sector agnostic and region agnostic. You can be from anywhere in Africa. We really want to focus on the teams, what they're trying to build, and do we believe this has the ability to make an impact around the world?
Yeah, just a follow-up question from that. How is a single LP fund, like, is it any different from a corporate VC? Like, what is the difference there?
So there are different structures. One is that I only have one LP to essentially as VCs, we're always, we're returned about the return on the investment for our LPs. And so I essentially only have one LP to worry about and the return on this. And because he sets the tone for this, we are open to anything and everything that we think actually has a possibility to make a huge impact on the African ecosystem. So we actually have a PCC structure set up, and that is the small one difference. And so it's a protected cell company with a Mauritius base. We aren't a US base, but very much an African entity, 100% African owned. And so the returns and the decisions we make, we are a team of three, and we make all the kind of investment decisions. And so anything we do, we know it's going to affect all three of us through and through, but we don't have to worry about other LPs and their outside concerns or how they wish to invest those funds. So our IC committees are 100% what we agree to, and we make those decisions, and we know that no matter what, our LP is going to be happy with that.
Got it. Got it. Just diving deeper into the Jua Fund. How do you source these deals? Like, what's the screening process like? I know there's the Jua Fund Kickstarter Olympics, where to which you sort of have an accelerator, not an accelerator of the sorts, but you have these companies applying, and then from there you shortlist companies that you would potentially invest into. So yeah, if you could just walk us through the deal sourcing part as well as the screening part.
So initially, when the Jua Fund was set up, the idea behind it was we wanted to create a competition to essentially showcase the best of the African entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. And so there was a call out essentially for this contest where founders would participate over the course of a week and pitch us during this contest, right? So they would come, the first day was on the pitch, the second day was on the team, finances, go-to-market strategy. All of these things happened over the course of that week. It was a great event. We loved it a lot and had some amazing founders that came from it. But one of the things that we found was that the contest form wasn't going to work for us in terms of a long-term strategy. A lot of times, I think when founders are applying for a contest, it's essentially a one-off, right? They have an idea, they want to work on their project, and so they've applied essentially for a contest to get extra funding under their coffers. But it doesn't mean that this is kind of a long-term project they want to work on. So it's very different from a founder that shows up and pitches for a contest versus a founder that's going in, pitching to a VC and wanting a long-term partner, and what they're trying to build and what they grow. And so initially we started with this contest model, but moving forward, no more contest model at all. Essentially, we are looking at founders that are pitching us, or vice versa, we're out there actively trying to source those deals. And so you asked, one of the basic ways I think is one is having founders that find us via Crunchbase or any other kind of news source, data source, deal room. They're coming to us kind of fresh off the bag and just pitching us on our website. I try to be really diligent about having all of our founders go through the same process, so there's no biases, and so that everyone is entering the same way. And I have all the same information I'm asking from one founder as the other. So we ask all of them to go online and to click on that little yellow button that says pitches. And that way, everything, all the information I need to make kind of the initial decisions, is this a company that's a good fit for us? I have that kind of off the bat. Secondly, it's always great to go out and to source and to find founders, right? And so that is being, knowing what's happening in the ecosystem. Am I reading the latest news? Am I following up on what's happening in Disrupt Africa or TechCrunch or any of the other publications that TechCobalt that exist? What am I reading on a day-to-day basis to understand what are the changes happening in the tech ecosystem? Also, how do I work with other accelerators? So the same thing, from Founders Institute to Techstars to Y Combinator. How am I constantly keeping my eye on what's happening in the ecosystem to know who those next setups are that are starting off at the early stages? How do I build those relationships so when it comes time to fundraise, I essentially have the kind of early into those founders? And so always that. Third one is that founders are, the best founders, they also know how to find you as well, right? So they're out there asking questions. They're talking to other founders, trying to figure out, does this make sense? Are these investors a good fit based on what it is I'm building? And so they're reaching out to us constantly. So on any given day, I would say I have at least 10 to 20 new requests from founders all over the world that are essentially pitching me, trying to figure out, does it make sense? And then I think finally, just doing events like these, right? The more that we're out there and building these kind of public personas and working in the ecosystem, more people come to know that we exist, they know that I exist, and they know that it is possible and that we have the ability to fund those founders. And so there are a ton of different ways. We're open to all of those things. And we don't necessarily, I think I'm always surprised even now when I hear people talk about the idea of having a warm intro, right? And we know that there's lots of biases built into that warm intro thing. And so we like to say, code intro is fine too, right? But there's also the art of how do you do a code intro as well, right? It's not just, it's not just sending me a blank invitation on LinkedIn and trying to get in my box. It is, trying to write something, write an email or write a couple of words that's actually going to catch my attention and make me want to know you or connect with you. So no warm intros needed, but certainly one has to know how do they stand out of the pile, given that, on any given day, an investor is being pitched 20 different ways on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, on any of these Clubhouse or any of the other kind of social media sources.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's also an important learning for our Bangladeshi entrepreneurs as well.
Right.
So just diving deeper, what are some reasons for you to say no to a founder in these, these companies that you screen at Jua Fund? What are some reasons that would be, a deal breaker for you, so to speak?
So, I mean, I think part of this is really, I think people say the same thing over and over again, right? At the very early stages, because we are a pre-seed fund / seed fund, it's all about the founder, right? It's those very early interactions with them from the very beginning when we're first kind of meeting and chatting. And so I want to know for sure that you are 100% committed to running this business. Like on a very basic level, do you really believe in it is what you're telling me? Do you believe that you are the right person to do it? And do I believe that like with the money I'm going to give you, you are going to spend it well to build what it is you're telling me you're going to build? And then are you passionate about it? And it's not just this idea of saying, I'm passionate. I was on a call with someone the other day and I after our kind of our team call, I said, I feel like this guy or girl tried to say the right things because he thought that's what we wanted to hear, right? But I want to hear it in terms of like the problem you're trying to solve. Are you so passionate about this that like that's all that you can think about and do? When I ask you, this is one of the things. It's the most simplest thing I do, and I'll give one of my little secrets away. I always ask founders, what would you be doing if you weren't doing this? Okay, this is a basic question. What would you be doing if you weren't doing this? If someone tells me they'd be a VC, that's probably not the right answer, right? That's what I had someone tell me. I'd probably be a VC. Or someone else, I'd be doing digital marketing. That's not what I want to hear. I want to hear that you're so into this project that that's all you'd be doing, right? The right answer is that there's nothing else I'd be doing, that I've been thinking about this. I found this solution. All I want to do is to create and to solve this issue. And so that's it. So I need to understand that like, this is really what you want to do, that you're very clear about what it is you're trying to build. You don't have to have all the answers. And I don't think any VC at this stage in terms of pre-seed, seed, wants or expects you to have all the answers, but we want you to be 100% committed to what it is that you're talking about you're going to do, what you're trying to build, and that you will build it with the money that I give you. And that's it, right? There's a trust in this space. We all know that with venture capital money or angel money, you write a check and then it's gone, right? You essentially say goodbye for the next 10 years, and we hope that there's an outcome later on. But there is no expectation of that, right? It is just that I believe, based on what you told me, that you can do what it is that you pitched me that you can do in this 10, 12-page pitch deck. And that's it. So if you can't do that, and if we can't get past the very beginning, and you can't convince me that you can do this, or that you're the right team, or that you're not just an opportunist that has decided that this is what it's going to be, but if there's a real connection in what you're trying to do, which is why we say, right? It doesn't matter if you failed before. Is there a real connection with what it is you're trying to build? Do you understand the market and the opportunity? And can you build it? And if I believe those things, then we're off to a very good start, and we can start going through the next stages of our due diligence sessions.
Got it. And I think thank you for sharing that little tip here about the question that you can ask about what would the founder be doing if they weren't doing this. I think that's a really important tip. Just learned it today. Just diving deeper now into how do you sort of structure these investments at the Jua Fund? Like what are your preferred instruments? Like, is it a safe note, convertible note from your experience? And like what is the valuation range usually like?
So I think it always depends, right? It always depends on where, because all founders are so different, depends on where they're coming in at what stage. I was talking to a founder on Friday who had everything built, right? He wasn't coming to money for us as an investor for money because he needed to build the MVP. He had all of those things already. So it really all depends on like where they are, what the stage is. Obviously in the emerging markets, it's not coming out with these kind of crazy, they're not starting off the back raising $4 million, although some people are. And so a lot of times we're looking at raises, but they're actually for a lot less. So I was in Cairo just, I'd say a week ago, I think just last week. I was in Cairo this time last week, and I was at a pitch event with 8 different founders pitching from all over Africa. And it ranged from $100,000 to like $4 million that they asked for. So it just depends on where the founders are in their process. We love to come in very early, so early stage. And this is somewhere getting between, I'd say, anywhere between 10 to 15 to 20% equity for that very first early stage risk taking. And those can be in anything from a safe note to convertible note to just a straight out, this is what it is that they're kind of giving up. And so this is always a conversation with the founder. There's never something that we predictate and we say that in order to come into this deal, we have to focus on this part of ownership. We don't do that. We're super flexible in talking about what it is the deal looks like. And then also looking at the other investors around the table to figure out what type of deal that they want to structure as a team and who essentially is going to lead that investment deal.
Got it. Yep. Thank you for that. And yeah, just wanted to learn more about, I think this Jua Fund advisory network is really interesting. So what is the role of, this team here in, adding value to your portfolio companies?
So the role of our advisory network is how do we look beyond the people essentially that are on our team, right? There's only so much that we can do as a team of 3 people. But when you look at this list here, from Andy to Ritesh to Chris, we are able to call on other people in the network to help that founder. So if it's just a question of we have an issue with packaging, or we want to figure out this logistic issue, or this is something we want to focus on hiring, we have a network beyond the 3 people that are actually serving on a day-to-day role at the Jua Fund, and they can be there with us. And so all of the advisors that are here pictured before you were all involved early on in the Olympics process. They all agreed that they wanted to be helpful and to be in the long-term part of this to helping our founders. And so we invite them to, let's say, 2 calls a year, where we essentially get on the phone with them and all of our portfolio companies, and the portfolio companies go through what their list is, what they need, and how they can be helpful, right? This is what I need help with. Can anyone on this call help me do this? I'm looking for someone that knows, someone in product management at Unilever who could help me make that introduction. And so that's what our network serves as. And they also serve as just, I think, a referral source for deals as well. If they're founders that they're seeing in the ecosystem that I don't have access to, they're able to encourage them and bring them to the Jua Fund website, 1, to pitch us, and 2, to deliver to me and say, hey, listen, I found this really great founder. You should take a look at them.
Got it. And, in terms of how long do you, speaking of your portfolio companies, how long do you intend to hold on? What's the exit path like? Like, do you look for co-investments when you are investing into these companies? And when you think about exits, how do you think about them?
So I think that it is like all funds, we have, we're working with the first fund here. It's a micro fund of $2 million that we're dispersing, let's say within the first year. That was our goal. And so we'll have fund 2 kind of coming on the heels of that, probably double, maybe it's going to somewhere between $5 to $10 million. I think we want to do much more for our fund 2. We essentially want to co-invest because we also understand that with only $2 million in this fund, you can't essentially lead all deals, right? So you have to be able to have other people to kind of round out, as you said before, if our founders are raising $1 million or $5 million or whatever it is, how do we have a group and network of people to kind of round out those deals? And so, again, always looking for co-investors. We understand that this, again, is not something that you can, you can't say when that exit is going to come. One of our companies is EdTech, and EdTech has been super hot during the pandemic, but it doesn't mean there's an exit path or an acquisition pathway right today. And so we understand that this is a long-term gain, and that any money we put into this, we're looking at least an exit of, the typical 7 to 10 year timeline, like all other funds.
Got it. And just thinking about in the sense of the Bangladeshi context, how would you, think about a market like Bangladesh, and how would it fit within your strategy, right? Like, would you, or are you encouraging your portfolio companies to look into the market?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the same thing is that we have to figure out how do we look at the places that other people aren't in, right? It's not just about that, Silicon Valley is super hot. Everyone's going to Silicon Valley. What we've even seen in the United States is that people are looking outside of these major cities. And so now you have areas like a Georgia or a Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, or Miami, Florida, or places in the Midwest becoming hotbeds of entrepreneurial activity because people, Silicon Valley is crowded, right? And the valuations are super high. And so it's always great to figure out how do you look outside of that? How are you looking at markets where maybe it's a little bit cheaper to come in? The resources that you need to actually go in and build a team is a lot less. And so instead of paying, an engineer, whatever, a six-figure plus salary to be in Silicon Valley, now you can come into a place, in Bangladesh or in Zimbabwe and hire someone with the same schooling, right? We all have access to the same schooling. We're learning the same things. And maybe it's a little bit cheaper to actually build those kind of teams to do it. And so again, the great entrepreneurs, that has no boundaries. There's no, Silicon Valley is not the only place where entrepreneurs are coming from. It's also about having access, and so can we find those entrepreneurs that are there in Bangladesh that have this great idea that can build something, and then can we properly fund them to actually do it? And so in terms of emerging markets, always interested in trying to figure out a way to have cross collaboration. And even I would say, and something as simple as Bright Knowledge you have on the screen here, it's essentially an education platform. And so it is a space for people to come to get tutoring help. And so someone that needs help or wants to learn language or the future of learning, that could be anywhere. A tutor that can help someone in math doesn't have to be that someone that's only based in Africa, or someone that wants to learn English, right? If there's someone that's coming to the platform because they've spoken their local tribal language, well, now you have a teacher that's based in Bangladesh that specializes in English, certainly they can use that platform. And so I think in both ways, how are we also being open to those other opportunities and saying that I have this skill set, I can make this work in this other context. It is not just about being limited to what's happening in Bangladesh, but listen, I can do this thing and export this all over the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I was just looking at these companies and realized some of these are actually pretty similar to some of the companies we have been seeing here in Bangladesh. And so that sort of, I think it echoes the fact that emerging markets, there's just so much potential here, just because it's such a large untapped market. Now would love to learn more about your personal portfolio, Vera. I know you invest in European startups as an angel investor for Atomico, and at a personal level as well in the areas of sustainable solutions, future of food, and broadening access to care. So would love to learn about, your personal investment thesis, like what are some guiding principles that sort of, encourage you to make decisions that sort of guide your investment decisions, besides, I know in the industries that you're already, have highlighted that you are, going to invest in those industries. But yeah, other than that, what are some other guiding principles that would actually influence your investment decisions?
Perfect. So again, as I said before, I started investing on my own before I became to this kind of space. And I think it was, one, as we all know on this call today, investing is a very, very expensive hobby, right? You have to be able to have that capital and the conviction that you believe in these founders and these teams to actually write that check. And so my first one, the first check I wrote was just last year. And then just yesterday, and what you're showing on the screen now is the investment, my most recent investment, Sundial, which is a plant-based alternative protein product. Essentially, these women are creating chicken, and they have a bone and they have an actual skin. So they were both students at UC Berkeley in the lab and of course, and they were working on trying to figure out how do they work on creating the moisture, right? Having it so that the meat isn't dried out. And so that's how they came about. They started working together. They flagged the attention of Nestle, who had been involved in this, spent a year working at Nestle and R&D in their accelerator, and essentially came up with the idea of creating this business called Sundial Foods. And so this was just announced yesterday. They raised $4 million at a $12 million pre-money valuation. And so I'm one of the few angels that came in on my own ticket, not even with Atomico, because my mandate with Atomico is to invest in European tech startups. And this one is actually a US company. And so it did not fit into, initially this, I had sourced it for Atomico. And when I understood that they couldn't do it because of the mandate, I had to say to myself, I've done this research, I've made these relationships with the team, I believe in this, and I wanted to write a check, via Atomico. They can't do it. So now the question is, can I, right? And do I believe enough to be able to write that check, right? Very large check, and then say that I'm going to say goodbye to this money for the next 10 years. And I did. And so this announcement is from Bloomberg now. They just closed the round last week and made it a public thing. And so now it's a question of sitting and waiting. But I have, in terms of my investment thesis, I struggled, I think, for a long time with trying to understand what it is that I wanted to do. And as you can see, this is a very, very diverse team. This is the kind of diversity that we need to see. So the founders are the two women in the middle. One is Caucasian, the other one is an Asian American. She's from China and had come over and did her PhD. And so this is the kind of diversity we're talking about in terms of what we want to see, those kind of non-traditional faces of people that are problem solving, that are working in this kind of plant-based research and figured out a way to essentially create this chicken texture and this chicken skin on chicken. And so I again, as I said, I was struggling to try to figure out what was most interesting to me. I had so much inbound coming, particularly when the announcement was made that I was going to be an Atomico Angel. And then I had to kind of sort this to figure out, well, what do I really care about? Is it fintech? Is it entertainment media? Is it healthcare? All these various things were coming to me. And I had to kind of sit down the basics and say, what do I care about? What's most important for me and my children, and what do I want to fund? And then just run with it, right? And then what is the expertise I bring? Because as we know, as angels, part of this is that like our founders are depending on us for questions and answers and how do we solve things. And so the one thing that I realized that I was so passionate about, having been a vegetarian for 30 plus years, was like food and the future and what that's going to look like. And so this has been my I would say a big part of my portfolio this year is going to be in this future of food space, not just human food, but also pet food, which is another big one that's kind of changing today, is looking at plant-based food products. And so for me this year, I think that the majority of my investments would be sustainable solutions, future of food, and then a little bit of healthcare. There may be one investment I do this year or in the next 6 months around this space, but really kind of the alternative protein space is going to be the big ones for me.
Yeah, and speaking of Sundial, I think it's really interesting given the fact that there is very much a need for plant-based meats right now. If we are going to, have a sustainable planet, definitely there's a very important need for this. Just wanted to learn more about your, personal investment thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you apply a gender lens approach when you are, making your investment decisions?
No, and unfortunately, it is because so the problem is that if I were only going to look for a very, let's imagine that I said I only wanted to invest in women of color, women and being of color and Muslim, right? Say this was the thesis that I wanted to have. It would be a very, very slim pickings in terms of what it is that I care about in these particular things. If I was sector agnostic and I said I could invest in anything and everything, then maybe it's a lot easier. But if I'm saying that the only thing I care about today, right? Imagine, let's just even say plant. Let's talk about pet food. Huge trend, huge movement now to create plant-based pet foods now all over in the U.S. We've seen companies doing crazy valuations with it, and now more so in Europe. If I only wanted to invest in pet and plant-based pet foods in Europe for a woman of color Muslim, I wouldn't find anyone at all, right? That just is like the reality is that they're not going to exist. And so I don't apply this rule. However, it is important to me to talk to the company about how they see diversity. So anytime I have the conversation, when they look at me, right, they see that is something that's I mean, either you can be blind and you think it doesn't matter to me, but it does, or we can address this when we're having the conversation about how they're trying to create diversity, be it on their teams, what they're building, what their advisors look like. And so it's always that thing, like, what are you doing? What are the steps you're taking to be more inclusive? And a lot of times the founders, they know, right? They're going to tell me, we haven't really worked on this so much, but we really want to work on it. I also take the other approaches when I talk to teams that are all male, or even just all European male. I try to say to them, listen, I have no bias against you either, right? I also care about these things too. And so if you are building this, and I believe that you are the team to build it, I'm going to fund you. So I don't have these biases either on both ends. I don't come to the table with a bias to say that I will only invest in all women teams or people of color teams. I just really want to work with the best founders. However, I want to make sure overall that you have a plan in place to figure out how do we have more diverse people, because it's going to help you and help your business grow.
What are some barriers that underrepresented founders, like women or those of Latina origin, Black founders, they sort of face in attracting investments? And why do you think is it important to invest in and support more such ventures, in the sense that what is the business case to fostering diversity and inclusion in startup ecosystems? We could talk about such as in terms of payoffs for portfolios. So yeah, from your experience.
I think that the payout, right? I think there's a clear case is that, like, again, if everyone's only looking at what's happening in Silicon Valley, you're missing out on what's happening all around the world. We also know that this, in certain countries like Africa, where there's 1 billion people, with the statistics predicted there'll be 2 billion people in a few years. These are young populations where they're mobile ready, and they're using mobile money and things that we aren't even using at all in Europe. A lot of this stuff has been, in the Europe, and it's been, what's the word for it? We've been moving forward with these digitalization. Yes, we've been moving forward with digitalization because of what's happened with COVID. And a lot of these folks have been doing the same thing. So I would say that in general, there are billions of people around the world that we haven't even tapped into yet at all. And we can figure out how do we help and use technology to solve those kind of everyday problems, everything from saving money to grocery shopping, to having food delivered to you, to any of those kind of things. And so part of this is that, like, if you're only focused on the people in the United States or in Europe, then you're missing out on half of the world. And so the business case is, like, very clear, right? There is nothing more that you need to say, is that there are billions of people around the world that we aren't even tapping into yet. And given the same type of technology, we can see kind of a tremendous growth. And they're markets, right? Everything from, as we talked about, alternative protein, to figuring out how do we do healthcare, to ed tech. And we saw this in India with the explosion of these kind of ed tech platforms during COVID. There are all these things that are happening in the United States that can be mimicked and modeled, and not even just mimicked and modeled, but essentially created to kind of deal with the kind of unique issues that people in those regions face. And so the business case is there. There are billions of people around the world. You can only focus on the West if you want, but essentially there are other people that are willing, ready, and able. And there are these emerging middle classes where people can actually afford it and use the technology to essentially change their lives. So if you, there is no, if you don't understand the business case by now, I'd say tant pis, as we say in French. Don't worry about you, and leave it for the rest of us that actually understand and are going to actually work and help to kind of change these ecosystems.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Vera. And very important learnings that I'm going to take back personally from the session today. And won't take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for spending
Thank you as well. Thank you, Ariana. You guys are great, and really, if there are deals that you all know of, please feel free to reach out. Connect on LinkedIn. You write a note. Don't just do a blind thing if we have no connections and you're reaching out to me from another country, but send a nice little note and let's connect. And again, if there are deals that you see, or even the deals that I see, I'm really happy to be able to share and to be a branch to make some connections and figure out how do we do things across emerging markets with other investors. So thank you.
For sure. Thank you, Vera. And have a great rest of the day at the same time.
Thanks, you too. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.